Good morning. It is so good to be with you all. If you're here with us for the first time, or it's your first time, it's obviously your first time at this service at 10 a.m. I want to just introduce myself. My name is Jason, and it's my privilege to be the directing pastor at this church. During the message, we're going to be looking at this passage of the Bible from the Old Testament history book of 1 Kings. And we're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 17. If you want to pull that up on your phone, we are using the New Living Translation of the Scriptures today. I want to point out a couple more new things because I know you haven't had enough new things today. Yeah, laugh, groan, stones throwing at me. I get it. No, joking. No, hey guys, so here's the deal. On this card that you received, worship card, there's a place if you want to jot down some notes there during the message. And at the bottom of that, there's a little communication card at the end. If you want to let us know that you're here, that would be awesome. If you want to volunteer to serve in a certain way at the church, you can put that on there too. We're going to collect those at the end of the service. But something else that we're offering starting this week is, we've done different things with sermon notes here at Crossroads over the years. And people have said, boy, it would be great if we had like one way to keep all of our message notes together. So we have a couple different versions of journals for you to pick up on the way out. There's a table out there. For a small donation, you can pick this up. This is not a Moleskine, but it's like a Moleskine. And you can write any sermon notes in there that you want to write down in there and just keep that with you. You could also use it as a prayer journal in between messages, in between Sundays, because, we really do believe that God doesn't just speak one day of the week, but God speaks to us throughout the week. And so before we just kind of jump into the word this morning, I just want to invite you to mentally get ready to maybe hear from God. This morning with everything new going on, I got to tell you, the theme going through my mind this morning has been logistics. I've been thinking about logistics all morning long. As I'm serving communion, I'm like, am I going to run out of juice? Am I going to run out of juice? I didn't run out of juice. Hey, perfect amount of juice, right? All these different things. You may be thinking, oh my gosh, the lights, the pews, whatever, it's new. But here's the thing. That's good. That's natural. We're all going to deal with that for a bit. But right now, at this moment, God might really want to speak to us, like in a real and profound kind of a way. And so what we're going to have to do is accept his invitation to just now not think about all those things for just a half an hour, for just 20, 25 minutes, and just see if God might want to speak to us through his word this morning. So it was about 21 years ago that I started really following Jesus Christ. And it's not that I hadn't tried prior to that. I had tried several times growing up and just failed. I would follow for a while, then I would just jump ship. I wouldn't persevere. It was too hard. It was too lonely. But something was different this time. 21 years ago, I started following Jesus, and I have been a satisfied customer following Jesus ever since then. Now, there were several things that were different about this time as I started to follow Jesus 21 years ago. One of the most significant things, though, that was a difference maker for me at that time was that I broke up with a girlfriend, okay? Now, I was 22 years old. I was living in Austin, Texas. I didn't know hardly anybody in this city. And I'd been dating this girl for about 6 months. And she was like the main person I knew in this city. But then I started following Jesus, and I began to feel like God was telling me that we were not supposed to be together. And this was weird because I thought we were supposed to be together because we started going to church again together. So I thought maybe God had put us together so that we could get each other on the right track and that we were supposed to be together. But then after following Jesus for a couple months, I felt like God was saying, no, this is not the one for you. And this was a very heavy and troubling thought because I was scared. Well, if I break up with this girl, I'm going to be lonely in the city again. And what am I going to do on Friday nights? Who am I going to hang out with in the evenings? It seems like it's putting myself in a very lonely situation. And I was scared how she would respond. Angry women are just very hard for me to be around sometimes, Not that I have any in my life. All the women, no, I better just stop. I can't say I keep them happy, but anyway. So I was terrible at breaking up with people, terrible. I mean, what I would normally do up to that point was I would just become more and more disappointing as a boyfriend with people until it fizzled so much that they just called it off. They lost interest. They saw anything's better than this guy. It was before texting. I was a coward. I would have been a great ghoster if there was texting, but it was before that. But I felt like God was saying, you want me to break up with this girl, but he wanted me to just do it honestly and just with more integrity than I'd ever done before. So I did, and it was brutal, and it was hard, and it was painful, and it was lonely. I all of a sudden was alone again on Friday nights and on weekends and on evenings. But as I did that, in what I felt was a response to God's impulse in my life, what it did was create a margin in my life that God then began to refill with new things. It created a margin. All of a sudden, new friends began entering into my life and inviting me into their lives. The people that I'd met at this little church began inviting me over to their homes to hang out, to have dinner, to do things that didn't result in a hangover. It was like a whole new way of doing life for a young man. And God started showing me that there were things that I could do to make a difference in other people's lives. That, hey, it doesn't have to be all about Jason and what he wants. There are ways that I could serve others with the skills and with the personality and with the abilities that God had given me. And all of a sudden, I was finding really meaningful time spent just serving others in God's name. It was like a new thing. I never thought about this, caring more about others than myself before. But then probably the greatest thing that happened was that I began to experience a real close relationship with the living God. And I began to develop a conversational relationship with Jesus. God just filled in this margin that had been created by my obedience to him in ways that were wonderful. It wasn't until a year later that I started dating Janice. It was a year of margin. It was a year of just God putting in what he wanted in. Now, it made me really realize during that year as I was experiencing these new things, these good things, that I really can trust God. And I remember thinking several times, I wish I had known this when I was younger. I wish I had known in middle school. I wish I had known in high school. I wish I'd known in college that I could trust God to meet my needs for friends, for community, for meaningful time invested in others. I wish that I had known that I could trust God to fill in the gaps that were created by obeying him. But as I stepped out in obedience, making myself lonely, God led me on this adventure. And I wouldn't trade that year for anything. It was one of the richest years of my life. Well, before I started dating Janice, I better stop. There's no way that's going to end right. So, anyway, you can trust God. You can really trust God. You can trust God to meet all of your needs, relationship needs. You can trust God to meet all of your financial needs as you obey him. You can trust him to meet all of your future guidance needs. So today, we're going to be starting this 5-week message series on this Old Testament character, Elijah. Now, this is one of my favorite Bible characters in the Old Testament, and I've never done a message series on him, so I'm very excited about that. But let me tell you a little background on Elijah. Elijah was a man of God or a prophet of God from the 9th century BC. As a prophet, God would tell him to tell other people things, and he would tell other people things. And he was a prophet of God in the 9th century during the reign of one of the worst human kings that has ever lived on planet Earth. A king in northern Israel named Ahab. And Ahab married a woman named Jezebel. If you ever hear somebody called a Jezebel, or you've heard Jezebel used negatively, it's because of the woman that Ahab married. Just listen to this background on Ahab. It says, Ahab, son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria, and that was the capital city of northern Israel, 22 years. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And as though it were not enough to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he began to bow down in worship to Baal. First, Ahab built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up an Asherah pole. He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. So Ahab instituted the worship of this fake god named Baal. Now, Baal was perceived to be the god of two things: the god of fertility and the god of rain or dew. Now, the way people worshiped gods or goddesses of fertility was through indecent sexual things. Sometimes with many people, often with religious prostitutes who were used in the worship of these fertility gods and goddesses. And so this made God angry. I mean, God said in the Big Ten Commandments, right, no gods but me. But then when the worship of that God leads to all these other things, it just made God more angry than he'd ever been at a human king. And not only was God angry, Elijah was angry. Because Elijah loved God, and he loved God's people, and he saw them doing these things. And so what we learn from the New Testament commentary on this historical event is that Elijah began praying that God would withhold rain over Israel. It says in the New Testament letter of James, written by the little brother of Jesus, it says, Elijah was a human being just like us. And he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain. Why was he praying that it wouldn't rain? Because the people that were worshiping Baal thought that Baal sent the rain. So they were worshiping Baal, so Elijah said, God, call off the rain. While these people are worshiping someone other than you, just make the rain stop. And so what we know is that God decided to answer Elijah's prayer. But then when we get to our text today, what it appears is that God then told Elijah, now I want you to tell King Ahab that it's not going to rain. I want you to go public with it. I'll do what you ask, but now I want you to tell the people of Israel that, hey, God's going to withhold rain. Now, that is going a little more public. To pray that it wouldn't rain in private, that's one thing. To announce to the king, the person who already hates you because you're a man of God, who rules the armies of Israel, to tell him it's not going to rain because you've been bad, that's a whole different thing. That was going to make Elijah go on the run. And how was Elijah going to be cared for? Who was going to provide for his needs as he was following God and on the run from Ahab? And that's where we're introduced to Elijah. It says this, now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, the God I serve, there will be neither dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go to the east and hide by Kerith Brook, near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food. So Elijah did as the Lord told him and camped beside Kerith Brook, east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening and drank from the brook. But after a while, the brook dried up, for there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I've instructed a widow there to feed you. So he went to Zarephath, and as he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks. And he asked her, would you please bring me a little water in a cup? As she was going to get it, he called to her, bring me a bite of bread too. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and the little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook his last meal, and then my son and I will die. But Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days in the containers. Oh, there was always enough flour and oil left in the containers, just as the Lord has promised through Elijah. So this is where we're first exposed to Elijah. Elijah steps out in faith in a big way, and God comes around and meets his needs in these fantastic ways. Really supernatural things get to happen. Now, we're going to see things really ramp up for Elijah. Next week, Sarah's going to be preaching on the epic supernatural showdown of the entire Old Testament. That's going to be coming next week. This week, let's just learn a little bit about how God provided for Elijah. And here's the principle that applies to all people of all time, and this applies to you as much as it did to Elijah. It applies to me. It applies to all of us. The principle is that obedience to God opens our lives up to God's supernatural provision. Our obedience to God opens our lives up to God's supernatural provision. When God tells us to do something through his word or through his spirit, and we act, even though we're afraid, all of a sudden supernatural things begin to happen. So we see in this a number of ways that God does this. One of the things we see is that sometimes God's provision comes in strange ways. Sometimes God's provision comes in strange ways. The first way that God provided for Elijah was through these ravens. Ravens were bringing him food. I mean, that kind of thing doesn't happen very often. That's definitely not how we expect God to provide for our needs. But as we follow God, sometimes God provides for us in strange ways. You know, as I was thinking about that, it reminded me of a really interesting thing that happened that first year that I was following the Lord. And it was tied to this very thing. So I was working at this office in downtown Austin, and I just was not any good at managing my money, like no good at all. And I remember one Thursday afternoon in the office, I just looked at my checkbook, and I'm like, I got $25 to make it through to next Tuesday, which was payday. There was a couple other guys in the office that were just standing around, and one guy said, well, you got 25. I only got $5 to make it to next Tuesday. And this other guy, who was always really hungover, he said, man, I've only got the change on my carpet to make it through to next Tuesday. I'm like, we stink. We should not be allowed to be adults. We just have no ability to manage regular things. Anyway, I went home, and the next morning I got up and I was just reading the scriptures. I was in this Bible study, and we were reading through sections of the Old Testament. And that morning I read about how God provided for the Israelites when they were in the wilderness by raining down bread from heaven. Like manna, it was called. And manna means, what is it? We don't know, but it's there for us every day. God would rain down bread from heaven each day. I thought, oh, that's cool how God provided for them. He rained down bread for them. And I didn't think about how it applied to my situation, but then I went out to my car. And I lived on this busy street, this very eclectic street with all kinds of people, from elderly people to strippers to drug dealers, all in the same apartment complex. And so people would come and they would just park and hang out there for the evening. And so people were always coming and going. But as I walked out to my car, I saw something out of the corner of my eye in the middle of the street. And I thought, that looks like money. So I walked over there, and covered with rain was a $20 bill. And I thought, oh my gosh, this God stuff really works. He rained down money for me. And then I saw something else out of the corner of my eye. And I walked over. It was a $50 bill. Now, I am like trying to figure out, if I was going to return this, where could I return it? I'm like, who knows who was here last night? There's nowhere to return it, but everybody will say they lost it if I go to anyone and ask them. That was the kind of street it was. So I said, well, this is God providing for me by raining down money, and for the two guys at work who are also broke. So I did what you're supposed to do when you're broke, but you get a little bit of money. I went straight to Burger King and bought breakfast. That was before Taco Bell served breakfast. Taco Bell was closer, but they didn't have it. So I broke the 50 by getting breakfast at Burger King. I went to the office. I said, guys, you're not going to believe this, but I've been following God. You know that. And God rained down money for us. He gave me a 20, and here, you guys can have this. It was for all of us. I read this story this morning. Is what God did. They looked at me like I was totally crazy, but they took the money. And I thought, God is awesome. I don't have to have my life figured out. I don't have to be great at budgeting for God to meet my needs. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be super organized. As I'm living for God and trying to follow Him, God promises to meet my needs, sometimes in strange ways. And I wish I could say that happened all the time. It never has happened one more time that I know of in anybody's life, that God rained down money from heaven. But I tell you what, He's never disappointed me. And I have been in some tight spots, financially, relationally, and otherwise. I'm telling you, man, God has always come through, sometimes in strange ways. Another thing we see here is that God's provision is going to look different at different times. God first provided for Elijah through the ravens and through the water in the brook. Then the brook dried up. And then God said, go to this other place. Sometimes God provides for us one way at one season, and then another way in another season. And as I've been a pastor here for 4 years and met with many of you and prayed with many of you, I know that sometimes we've all gone through this experience where one brook just dries up. One stream of income, one stream of relational support, it dries up. And then we're scared. What we see here is that God always provides for us. Sometimes it's different in whatever season we're in. So here's what we want to do. We want to do what Elijah did, and that is we want to listen to what God says next. This is why it's so important to stay in the habit of weekly worship and reading the scriptures, because God always will lead us through to the next season of provision, but we've got to get our instructions from Him. That creek dried up. God said, hey, go to this other place. I've instructed a widow to feed you. Another thing we learn is that sometimes God's provision comes through new people. And this is really interesting. God told Elijah, I'm going to provide for you through someone that you haven't met yet. And so God had apparently told this widow that she was supposed to provide for Elijah when he got there. But Elijah had to leave the brook. He had to leave the creek, which had worked before, and he had to go and encounter this person. Sometimes we hold on to things too long because we're not sure that God is really going to give us something better if we let go. And we hold on to things. We hold on to grudges. We hold on to old ways of thinking. You may hold on to toxic relationships because we're afraid that if we let go, something better won't be waiting. What we see is that when God calls us to move on, that He has new things prepared. And if we have to move out of one situation and move into another one, God will be waiting with other things. God didn't provide Janice for me to date and eventually marry and have a family with until long after I had broken up that other relationship. And if I hadn't, this is what I was thinking about this week. If I hadn't been able to obey God in that moment when it was really hard, and broken up with that girl, I clearly wouldn't be here. I would not be here. I would not have the kids I have. I would not have the wife I have. I would not have the life I have. I wouldn't be here with you. Sometimes we have no idea that a moment of obedience might change the whole direction of our life for the greatest possible way. Now, finally, we learn that God provides for us as we provide for others. In verse 8, we read that God tells Elijah that He's instructed a widow to feed Elijah. Elijah goes there. God's spoken to this lady. When he gets there, the lady has enough bread and flour to prepare one last meal for her and her boy, and then she's going to just lay down and die. But as he goes over to her in obedience, and she responds in obedience, then look at what happens. Verse 15. She did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. Boy, so much goodness lies on the other side of obedience. We feel like we don't have enough. We feel like we're afraid to let go. We're afraid that if we move forward as God told us to do in whatever way, there won't be enough. What we understand is there won't be enough if we don't obey God. God's abundance is poured out relationally, spiritually, financially. To sustain those who live for Jesus. When Jesus was given the basic instructions for being a disciple in his sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he said it comes down to this: seek the kingdom of God above everything and live rightly, and he'll give you everything you need. Now, if we would keep reading in chapter 17, what we'd see next is that the woman's son, sometime later, gets sick with some strange illness, and he dies. So then she calls Elijah and says, my son has died. Elijah goes and prays over the boy, and the boy comes back to life. And what this does is foreshadow the coming of the greater Elijah, Jesus Christ. It all points to him. If you haven't figured that out yet, as you read the Old Testament, it's all pointing ahead to Jesus, God the Son, who would meet our need for life after death through his life, death, and resurrection. Jesus, who would meet our need for reunion with our loved ones who died believing in him through his life, death, and resurrection. It doesn't matter what our need is. As we obey God, we open ourselves up for God's provision in supernatural ways. So my question for you this morning is this: what does obedience look like for you today? Today. Following Jesus is always about today. It's not what you did 21 years ago, right? What does it look like for you today? Is there something that God's calling you to let go of? There's something that God's calling you to lay hold of. God's supernatural provision lies on the other side of our day-by-day, moment-by-moment obedience. And as whatever it is God is calling you to do, you begin to do it, and you keep doing it, you'll see him do abundantly far more than all you could ask or imagine. That's what it means to follow Jesus. Let's pray.